Thanks for joining us.
Sorry.
Oh.
We started.
Okay, I thought-
Doing.
No,
First
yeah.
frame.
Okay, let me know when to start then.
Go for it.
Thanks for joining us. Since we're going to talk about how technology influences our behavior, I will start asking you, what devices do you own?
What devices I own? Good question. I have an iPhone, but not iPhone X because I don't like the idea of facial recognition, even though it can scan your photos and tell you who's who. So that's slightly a double standard. I have a MacBook. I have a family of MacBook Pros because I don't ever throw them away. I think I just use them as sort of hard drives. What else do I have? I guess that they're my primary devices. Yeah.
How often do you use them? Do you take any time without any tech devices?
Yes, sometimes. So usually in the year, although last year I didn't do this, usually I'll take 2 to 3 weeks of the year with literally no phone,
Whoa.
no laptop, just to reconnect. If I'm ever on retreat for like a few days, I might have my phone to operate as an alarm, but usually the airplane mode is completely on the whole time, and I just will make a decision not to check stuff.
And
So,
how does that feel?
Oh, it's a relief. It's like being on flights when no one can call you for 10 hours if it's a transatlantic flight. I actually find it very restful. Apart from then at some point you start getting itchy feet or you get a bit bored, but actually that's a useful moment because then you start becoming more creative and imaginative. But yeah.
Does your working style change or your lifestyle while doing this?
That's an interesting question. Well, working style, I work on my laptop when I'm doing research or writing for things, or if I'm interviewing people, then it's all kind of based through the laptop. But if I am working on something like a book using my laptop, then I have to have my phone switched off, or at least on silent, and my notifications are always switched off. And it just means that I can dive in deeper, knowing that I'm not going to be distracted by notifications or the possibility that I could be missing something. So yeah, I would say that it changes the way that I work. Yeah.
And apart from this, if you could change something about your online behavior or your mobile user behavior, what would you change?
I would love not to be so seduced by whipping out my phone all the time. One thing that I realised a while ago was that I was walking around with almost like an imagined audience in my head. Like, if you see something this is when Instagram was still using square crops, I realised at a certain point when I was using it quite a bit, so I'd take pictures of landscapes because I like that I would be looking at the landscape and looking at the landscape as if through the lens of a square crop. I was like, this is fucked up. Like, I can't just go around looking at the world as if it's through this kind of weird crop. Yeah, so it does change the way in which I interact with the world, I think. Yeah, so I would probably change that, find some way for it not to be so influencing in the way in which I interact with the world.
Do you have any ideas on how you would do it?
Good question. Actually, yes, one, which might sound a bit odd, is to really be present, make the effort to really be present when you're with other people. So I found that, I'm now living in Barcelona, and I find it to be a lot more social. So you might spend, instead of like 3 hours down the pub with your mates, you might have a whole day on the beach or in the square. And what I've noticed is that while people in Barcelona will spend time on their devices, on social platforms, arranging to meet up, when they're physically present with one another, the phone never comes out, apart from if it's to take photos at some point in the evening. You very rarely see phones at all.
That's great.
Which is amazing. And I started realising how much more rich the experience is when you're in a relationship with people, when you're physically present and mentally present, and you're not being distracted by that. So yeah, put it away more often, spend time with people that you actually enjoy the company of. Yeah, those are the things that I think make the biggest difference.
Nice. And so you said you like Instagram quite a bit.
Yeah.
If you'd have to keep just one app starting tomorrow, which one would you keep?
Just one app?
Yes.
Spotify.
Really?
Oh yeah, without doubt. Yeah, music trumps all the other stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
Does that count as an app?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And do you track, so you were saying about how you use technology, do you track in any way your mobile behavior or how much time you spend on social media and so on?
No.
No.
The only way that I've been able to track, well, it's kind of a proxy for amount of time spent on Twitter. I used to schedule tweets. Like, I used to read at the weekends loads of different publications that I thought would be really interesting. So I have a whole folder of things that I would read through. and then I would schedule all my tweets for the week for things that I thought would be interesting to share. I'd do that on a Sunday evening and then schedule maybe 3 to 5 tweets. And then I realised it was taking so much time and that maybe people were not, I don't know if they were that interested or not, and I thought, it's not really bringing me that much joy. I'd much rather get on a stage and actually have a conversation about this. So I reduced it to 3 tweets a day and then to 2 tweets a day, and then now it's like sporadic. When I feel like sharing something, I will. And so that as a proxy for use, my use on Twitter has gone down. I came off Facebook like 6 years ago.
Oh wow, how did you do that?
Fiercely. I was really pissed off at the way that they tried to coerce people to staying on. It was just after the 2012 paper came out. It was researchers at Cambridge University looking at large-scale psychometric testing and how you can extract people's intimate information, things like personality, whether they're gay or straight, proclivity towards drug use, ethnicity, religious and political affiliations, just from their likes. So when this paper came out, I was like, I can see exactly the potential for this. And I came straight off. It made me really angry because I realised straight away what was going to happen. I told my friends, and they were all basically just saying, oh, you're a conspiracy theorist, you're not. I was like, wait and see. Anyway, and now we've got the shit show that is Cambridge Analytica scandal with Facebook, and so it's, and that was 6 years ago. So. Yeah. Sorry, a slight rant there.
No, that's great. So now on social media, you just use Twitter and Instagram?
Yeah, what else do I use? Twitter and Instagram. I was using Snapchat for a bit, but I don't really use that. WhatsApp I use because people tend to use that a lot as a platform for just messaging in groups, which I find I do a lot more of. I also use Signal, which is one of the most secure messaging apps, which is good if you're doing like video calls and stuff like that. Pretty sure that's it. And then LinkedIn, but I don't know if you'd class that as a social platform or it's kind of social business, but I don't use that very much.
So, speaking of how people behave online, what made you write Webs of Influence?
Okay. So I started thinking about design and its impact on behaviour in 2010. Because my background, so I did a degree in psychology and then I went and learned how to design and develop websites. And it got to the point where I suddenly thought, well, surely there's some research on how online environments shape behaviour because there's research on how physical environments shape behaviour. And I looked and there was nothing. But, UX wasn't a thing. Human-computer interaction was quite different in its scope. The behavioural sciences hadn't yet become something which the mainstream was interested in. So Kahneman's book hadn't come out, Thaler's book hadn't come out. And I couldn't find any literature that was satisfying. Or kind of diverse enough in its scope. So I thought, fuck it, I'm going to write the book that I would like to read. And so I did. I read a huge number of papers from all sorts of disciplines, from cognitive psychology, social psychology, cross-cultural. You've got some stuff around linguistics, the way that we process visual information, all kinds of things. And then wrote the book, and I was lucky that it got picked up, the timing was right, and no one had written anything yet. And I think because I wanted to prove that it could be really academically rigorous in terms of the research it was citing, but also accessible, I was quite careful to try and make it as easy to digest as possible without losing any of the richness of information. So that's, yeah.
And what kind of people do you address with your book?
I'm kind of a bit polymathic, so it's basically for anyone who's got an interest in various aspects of the online world and how it influences us. So when I was writing it, I had in mind people who are designing platforms and products, people who are web designers, developers, because you're basically still, no matter what you're creating, whether you're designing or developing, it's for human use, right? Or people who are creating marketing content or advertising content or copy, or videos, anything that touches on human experience, where you're creating something for someone else. Because everything's ultimately connected. When you're creating an online experience, you're talking about a huge number of people creating one experience which hopefully is going to be engaging and coherent. So then you have to address all of these people, otherwise, kind of some people have access to greater knowledge than others, which just doesn't make sense to me.
Can you tell me a little bit about the key messages of your book and of your work?
Sure. Yeah, so a few key messages. The first is that if you want to understand how best to engage people in a way that they're going to enjoy, that's going to be fun or useful or meaningful, you have to understand about the influences that shape our behaviour. So that can be things like decision making, the different ways in which we make decisions, so that can relate to differences in personality, age, gender, culture, which is fascinating. Also to do with goals or It could be that you're buying something for a functional reason versus an emotional reason. That also changes behaviour in terms of how we make our decisions. And then different persuasion principles, how they can be applied in an online context. And one thing that is really important that forms the lens through which to look at all of this stuff is, of course, the ethical perspective, the responsibility piece. So when we're creating stuff for other people, you have to think, well, how is this going to impact the other person? Would I be all right if someone used this principle on me? And if the answer is yes, because I trust the brand, it makes my experience more fun, and they're delivering on their promise and they're treating me with respect, then that's brilliant. That's the win-win scenario. But when it comes to more coercive practices, that's when having access to this knowledge, you can start seeing the patterns that people are playing, so you can then make a different choice to go with a more responsible or ethical brand. So it's kind of, that's all in the mix. Yeah.
And do you think, you wrote the book a couple of years ago, do you think these principles or the tech landscape has changed in any way since you wrote the book?
Yeah, so the first edition came out in 2012, and then it was, I don't know if you remember, things changed so quickly in the second. So Twitter and Facebook were still super young, and so people were still needing a bit of insight as to how to use the platform. So maybe it was a bit more functional as opposed to content-based. So in the first book, I addressed more of those issues. In this new edition, because this came out in April of last year, since then there's been a lot more interesting research, especially around psychometric information, so personality profiling, which many more people now know about, and also the kinds of things that you can do on different social platforms. So it's more platform agnostic, but then interested in explaining some of the stuff that across different platforms will work well to gain attention and shape interactions. Yeah, so those are the main key things. So the psychometric stuff, the different platforms, and then updates and research which have happened within that sort of 6-year period.
I think there's also a lot of talk about ethics recently.
Yeah, quite rightly.
And I'm starting to see a little bit of a shift from trying to make people addictive to technology towards more mindful technology.
Yeah.
And do you see the trend? What do you think about it?
I think it's about time. I think it's something which has been quietly ignored for quite a long time, and the people that I know who've done research in these areas or who've written similar books to mine, so people like Nir Eyal, for instance, or Susan Weinschenk, or Roger Dooley, or those are the names that spring to mind. We have long since had conversations when we've been on panels or behind the scenes about, well, what does this mean? Like, on the one hand, we're teaching people how to engage people more persuasively, but it's very rare, or it has been typically quite rare, to hear about the so what of it. So it's like, okay, great, well, we increase our numbers, we get people to use this more. What does that mean in terms of an impact on society? So I see the trend very clearly. And I think it's one of these things where, on the one hand, you could potentially throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, no, let's not talk about any of this. On the other hand, you can make it publicly available and make sure that within the conferences and the books, you talk about ethics. You say, well, what does it look like to use these things ethically? Because ultimately, people are going to use tech. We're all going to use it. We want to have a good experience, but we also want to know that we're being respected at the same time. So I think it's a good thing that ethics is in the fore. And I think we do need to legislate for it, because otherwise the incentives are too great for typically large corporations or governments to use these things to serve their own ends, which is power or money or both. Yeah,
that's what I was going to ask you next. How do you think we could incentivize or some tech companies to look more into the ethics of what they build? Do you think apart from legislation, there's something else?
Yeah, I think if you think about the fact that most businesses, part of the incentive for them, or usually the most pressing incentive, is to make money. If enough people who are buying their products or using their products show that they are willing to spend their time, effort, money, attention towards products or on products and brands that are more ethical, then they're going to have to change their business model. Because, I mean, putting your money where your mouth is the best way to challenge business practices. So when you think about things like, for instance, people moving away from certain messaging platforms, well, suddenly WhatsApp decides to roll out end-to-end encryption. Why? It doesn't serve them to do that, because people want that, because people are using ad blockers and tracker blockers and VPNs in huge quantities. More people know about things like Signal. They're willing to pay more for encrypted services that might protect their privacy, like for Hushmail, which is like an encrypted mail server. And when you see people turning their backs on free platforms, quote unquote free platforms, then the only alternative is to offer some of the benefits that they're hunting out within the platform. Even though there's all sorts of stuff around metadata, they're still tracking other aspects of the information of interactions. But yeah, that's what I would say. And then also being public about it. If you find out that a company that you trusted that told you that your data was protected, and then you realize that they are not protecting it, call them out. And it's not about trolling, it's about saying, this is what was stated, this is the reality of what's happened, it's not okay. And just naming things as they happen, that's also super important.
Yeah, that's great. I think we saw some very good examples of that.
Yeah, I agree.
So you talk a lot about how behavioral design can persuade us to behave in a certain way at the subconscious level. How do you think we can use the same principles to create more diverse and inclusive communities?
Great. My answer would be quite simple, which is that when we're experiencing the world, we seek for recognition that we belong. And I think one of the ways in which we do that is to look to things like printed media, TV media, anything that's got people represented in it, to see if we're there. So if, for me, it might be like a short brunette who's got a mixed background, who does several things, whatever it might be. I might speak a couple languages. For someone else, it could be, I don't know, they're a belly dancing 60-year-old Iranian. Well, I'm describing one of my aunts here, but like the idea is that the more you see the plurality and the diversity of humanity reflected in the cultural media, the more we feel like we've been recognized and included, the more empowered we feel to make changes that are aligned with our values, because we feel like we have a say, like we have agency. So I would say something like that is super important. And Vogue has done a really interesting thing. They've got a new guy that's heading up the way that they run everything. And if you look at their front covers for the magazines, it's so much more interesting and beautiful and inclusive since he's come into power, because it's just more representative of the diversity and the different kinds of people that are out there. Which also has had a massive positive knock-on effect on sales. So there's also that piece to be played. But the more representative businesses become, the more inclusive they become, the more people will see themselves recognised, and probably the more popular the brand will be. So, yeah.
There's also a lot of talk about diversity in the tech industry.
Yeah.
And we've seen how company culture can play a very important role in keeping on board various voices in terms of gender or economical background. How do you think the products these online companies build influence other parts of the society?
Oh, that's such a good question. That's such a good question. Wow. Well, I think there's several threads that come to mind. So accessibility would be one. So how do we make certain online products accessible to people who maybe have difficulty hearing or seeing? For instance, I had an interesting conversation with someone the other day about using materials that create haptic feedback, so that you could literally, instead of braille, you could have some sort of textural response to something. That's wildly exciting. Can you imagine? Or it could be that you, rather than creating something without considering cultural context, you could create a product that is designed to have certain principles that are kind of hard set, but then you test it in different cultures and you maybe shape some of the user experience. So for instance, if you're thinking about cultures that are higher in uncertainty, so they're more comfortable with uncertainty, maybe you make it less structured, maybe you make it easier for them to explore something. Or I'm trying to think now to things like power distance. So a country which is more authoritative, maybe there needs to be a different way of creating a sense of authority and credibility in the way that they talk about whatever it is they're talking about. So there's lots of different things that you can do, but I think an awareness that different people have different contexts that shape their behaviours, and finding a way to build that into what you're building is a good place to start.
Thanks a lot for all the great insights.
My pleasure.